Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at Game 3 from the 1972 World Chess Championships between Bobby Spassky and Bobby Fischer. Now in Game 1, Spassky got the victory after Bobby Fischer made a questionable bishop sacrifice towards the end. Now after that game, Bobby Fischer made some pretty interesting requests. He didn't want any spectators around. He kind of wanted to play in a back room. He didn't want any cameras. And the tournament directors said, no, we're not going to oblige your request. And Bobby Fischer forfeited. So Spassky went up 2-0 in the match. Bobby Fischer was ready to leave, boarded a plane, ready to go. His team eventually convinced him to go ahead and stay. And Spassky, for whatever reason, decided to go ahead and play Game 3 in kind of this backstage room with no spectators. So that's kind of where we're at. Bobby Fischer did give up his Game 2 where he was going to be playing the white pieces. So Bobby Fischer down 2-0 playing against Spassky, and Spassky will be playing the white pieces in Game 3. So Spassky starts out with pawn to d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, knight f3, pawn to c5. So an opening we don't see all too often, but always fun to watch. Pawn d5, a pawn taking here on d5 after the recapture, pawn to d6. So this is the modern Benoni. If you're not too familiar, it's definitely an exciting opening because it's usually more open. Bishops tend to do a lot better. It's more aggressive lines than some of the pawn to d4 openings that you typically see, which are kind of more closed, more positional play. This can lead to some pretty crazy fireworks. Now, white's really going to be focusing on the light square. So from start to finish, the light square is very important, and it's all centered around this pawn on d5 right here. He wants to maintain control right here with his pawn and eventually have a nice little outpost here on c6, e6, and then just dominate his opponent. Now on the flip side, black's going to be looking to counter and dominate the black square or the dark squares. He's eventually going to fianchetto his bishop here to g7, add some a little bit more reinforcements with his bishop to control those, and then look for a counter push and start to chip away on the light squares. That's what both sides are going to be looking to do. So first we see knight to c3, pawn to g6, and then knight to d2. Now what's interesting is knight to d2 is not very common at all. Usually you see pawn to e4, just strengthening the pawn chain right here in the center of the board, keeping the knight over on the king side of the board. White has a pretty strong king side of the board, so pawn to e4, even bishop to f4, getting this bishop outside the pawn chains, always good. Bishop here to g5 potentially is always good. Then you kind of have a few options as far as how white wants to go from here. As soon as Bobby Fischer saw knight to d2, he kind of switched gears a little bit, because usually if you see pawn to e4, you may even play knight to a6, and then eventually swing him around on the queen side. You could play pawn to a6, but you're kind of counterattacking on the queen side of the board. After he saw Spassky play knight to d2, he then played knight to d7, starting to kind of look over here on the king side for his attack. Now pawn to e4, bishop here to g7, bishop here to e2, castle on the king side, castle on the king side, and then rook over here to e8, putting pressure the pawn here on e4. It is a backward pawn, does need some protection. Pawn to f3. Eventually, you may want to play this early on. You're not really going to want to, so it does make a lot of sense to go ahead and start to attack that with his rook here on e8. And then queen to c2, just continuing his developing pieces and adding another layer of protection. He does have both of his knights, but the queen here kind of allows those knights to do other things on board. But the next move from Bobby Fischer is kind of why he was at the time thought to be the best player. He was over 100 points or rated higher than Spassky, even though Spassky was the champion at the time. But the way he kind of thought about the game was very different. He plays knight to h5. And this is a really weird move. This is something that you would typically think that you might see from an amateur, because It goes against everything that you would expect. Because after bishop takes here on h5, all of a sudden the pawn takes back. There's a double pawn on the h-file. That's definitely not good. The king structure is definitely not good for the pawns. You can start to really chip away and attack. But Bobby Fischer played this knowing exactly what was going to happen. He just felt like he was going to get compensation for this. And so he went with the plan, and he started that plan ever since he saw that knight to d2. And honestly, Spassky wasn't exactly sure how to play or attack against this. He plays knight to c4, which I really think you need to just start moving your pieces over to the king side, especially with this weakened pawn structure. Moving away from the king side seems just very, very odd. I get that he does want to open up the door for his dark square bishop, but I think there's other ways to do that. Knight here to e5, moving his knight over here to e3 now. And then queen to h4. I think it's just way better if instead he saved a few moves, played knight here to f3. That also opens up the door for the dark square bishop to get involved, and it kind of holds the fort down so the queen can't come here to h4. But alas, in the game, knight here to c4, knight e5, knight e3, queen down here h4, and then bishop d2. Now knight g4, there is an exchange on board, and then the pawn recaptures on g4. I even think that the knight taking is probably bad. You could try something else here. You know, you could try pawn to h3, just forcing the knight to move. If the knight wants to take, hey, that's completely fine. Maybe now you see Bobby Fischer start to attack on the queen side. Pawn here to b6. Pawn here to f3, still trying to maintain control of the light squares on the board. But by taking here on g4, all this does is give Bobby Fischer a very powerful pawn here on the 4th rank. And it also takes away his double pawns, which seems absolutely pointless. But pawn takes here on g4. Now bishop up here, f4. Queen to f6, attacking the bishop, and then pawn to g3. And this is another one of those moves where you just feel like Spassky doesn't know exactly how to play in this position. This kind of just chips away at the light squares that he has on board. He really can't afford to play this. He eventually wants to be playing pawn to f3, really strengthen the light squares. Bishop just coming back here to g3 makes way more sense. He still wants to add pressure to on this square here on d6. He still wants to maintain, pressure with his bishop here on this file. And so I could see why pawn to g3 may make sense, but he needs to keep in mind what he's trying to do in this opening. And with the modern Benoni, he just needs to maintain control of the light squares. But he plays pawn here to g3, bishop d7, pawn a4, trying to push on the queen side, recognizing that although he should have been able to attack on the king side, he just was not able to. Pawn to b6, rook over here to e1, a6, rook e2, pawn here, b5, rook over here. Both sides just trying to maneuver a little bit, starting to attack in the center of the board. You do have this backward pawns here on e4 that both sides are both attacking. Bobby Fischer is definitely more in that attacking phase, and Spassky's more in the defending phase right now. Pawn here to b3, a rook here to e7, queen up here d3, rook b8. After the exchange right here, then we see kind of another questionable move, and it's pawn here to b4. This is one of the moves that I just really don't like, because after pawn to c4, this is just very difficult for Spassky to deal with the rest of the match. This allows Bobby Fischer to eventually get some nice little outposts here on b3, or even worse, d3. There's just not much you can do about this, and these are the light squares that Bobby Fischer really wants to control if he can. This pawn on b4, he has to recognize that Bobby Fischer is not going to take right here. Having a pawn structure in the center of the board like this is just bad for Spassky. He can be a lot more aggressive. Rook over here to a2, starting to attack on the open file. He can swing his other rook over here if he needs to. He does have both of his queen and his knights kind of defending this square. So he's fine right now. He doesn't need to play this pawn here to b4. But he does. Bobby Fischer responds pawn here to c4, and the queen drops back to d2. Bobby Fischer plays rook to e8, rook here to e3, pawn pushing over here h5, rook down here, e2, and then king h7. And king h7 is definitely one of those moves that had me scratching my head as I looked at it. Bobby Fischer has an aggressive position. He can start to just chip away on the board and have a much better position. King to h7, it's not really stopping anything. There's no threat that Spassky has on board. He could easily, in this position, just play bishop takes here on c3. After the queen takes, rook takes. After some exchanging on board, queen takes. And then all of a sudden, he's threatening this square here on d5. He's got a pass pawn right here that he can start putting pressure. White can't really do too much. If we even see bishop take here on d6, well, okay, this is bad. We see queen takes on d5, threatening the bishop. If the bishop tries anything, bishop back here to f4. It's all bad news. Queen check. All of a sudden, the bishop gets involved. c6. Bad stuff just starts happening. There's no way to really stop this. Even if we come back and say, okay, let's say the bishop does not want to come back. Queen here to c1. We could, if we wanted to, just say bishop here to c6, threatening mates here, and then just take that bishop. If instead we come back and say, let's assume the bishop doesn't even take right here. We could just see queen to c1. Okay, that's definitely an option right here. But then we're just taking this pawn here on d5. So there's nothing really good that's going to be stopping black right now. This is all kind of bad for white. So that's what I thought he should have done in the position. But instead we see pawn to h5, rook down here to e2, king to h7. But what's interesting is Spassky actually doesn't have much on board. He doesn't want to really move his pieces away because he recognizes that it's going to be even worse for him on board if he tries to do anything too crazy. So he just plays rook back here to e3, king back here to g8, and he says rook down here to e2. Let's try that again, Bobby Fischer. You played that king to h7, which made absolutely no sense. I'm going to give you another shot. You try it again. Take a mulligan here. Bobby Fischer says, okay, I found the right move. I'll go ahead and do that. So bishop down here, c3, and kind of the variation that we were looking at right here. We do see all the exchange on board. Definitely bad if the bishop takes. So Spassky decided to instead play bishop to h6. The one variation that we did not go over, knowing that it would come up on board. Queen to g6, threatening that bishop. Bishops come back here to c2. But queen down here, b1, is very difficult to deal with. Just putting so much pressure on white. Can't really move his bishop now. This light square bishop can start to get involved into the board. The queen can't really do anything because then the bishop could potentially fall. So Spassky decides for a different route. Not the route that I would go for. I really think he needs to play maybe pawn to f3. Just try to shake some stuff up on board. Maybe, pawn to f6 after this. We could see, exchange. Okay, now the queen comes down here, maybe starts to do an attack up to e8, maybe get some sort of perpetual check on board. I don't know what he could have done, but instead he decides to play king over here to f1. And anytime you want to get your king involved into the board, get him centralized, maybe make him an attacker on the board, it's usually when your opponent's queen is off the board. When your opponent's queen is on the board and they can just potentially attack and check and just chase you all over the board and just start gobbling up pieces, it's very, very problematic, and I usually don't want to see kings rushing to the center. But Spassky decides that's the best route to go. King to f1, a bishop down here to f5, king to e2. So getting super aggressive on board. Queen up here to e4, check. Queen over here, e3. Now the queen back here, check. The queen here to d2. Now queen up here to b3. Getting ready to take the pawn here, queen up here to d4, and then bishop down here to d3, check. And in this position, Spassky actually decided to go ahead and resign. And there's just honestly not too much that Spassky can do in this position. If we look at it and say, okay, what if the king comes down here to e1? Okay, well, now the queen takes on b4, check. After the king moves, then the queen just starts to come down here, b3. We can see the pawns starting to push forward. There's nothing really white can do to kind of stop these pawns. You can say queen here to c2, getting ready for a checkmate on board. If the queen comes down, hey, that's fine. We can sacrifice all day. The king can no longer come here. It's kind of this blockade here on d1, d2, d3. And then we can just start pushing forward, and there's no way to really stop this. Now, if we come back and say after bishop to d3, what if instead we see king starting to push up. King to e3. Okay, well now just queen down to d1 is actually very, very problematic. There's no real good way to stop this. So much threats on the board. But because this pawn on c4 is protecting the bishop, this bishop right here is just going to fall. Nothing good is going to happen. So if we see king up here to f4, then all of a sudden the bishop falls, and then we can start to push forward with our pawns eventually. All in all, Spassky just did not have anything that he could do, so he decided to resign. So Bobby Fischer, actually the first time in his career that he beat Spassky, but he did beat him with the black pieces, kind of a psychological move to take him into this back room with no spectators and beat him. So he is down 1 game to 2 wins from Spassky, but congratulations Bobby Fischer in Game 3, coming back after he almost gave up on the tournament. So next round we will be looking at Game 4 with Spassky playing the black pieces and Bobby Fischer going back to the white pieces, trying to level things up at 2-2. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching. We have a ton of games in this tournament. It is a long tournament, so hopefully you guys are enjoying, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.